Off-axis guiding is not as mysterious as some make it. As with all the shorts on the Astroimaging channel, this tutorial will only cover the highlights, and do it fairly quickly. Feel free to rerun the video and digest it at a more reasonable speed later. But let's get you focused on off-axis guiding. Auto-guiding is the process of taking a picture and choosing a guide star. Take another picture and see if the guide star has moved. If it has not, do nothing. But if it has moved, move the mount such that your star is back where it started, and do it again and again. There are several ways to do it, with their own considerations. The one we'll be talking about is off-axis guiding. If this is the main axis of the telescope here, we are going to pick off a bit of the light and move it off-axis to our guide camera up here. Some filter wheels come with a pick-off prism in front of the filter wheel. These things focus generally the same as an off-axis guider. Realize that the job of an optic is to take the whole aperture of nearly parallel rays coming from a distant object and bend them so that they come together at the sensor. Notice the triangular shape here. And note that no ray tracing as this can adequately show the near infinity of rays that are actually entering into the scope. These triangles are true no matter what type of scope you have. If you use a focal reducer or flattener, then you still have triangles, although the shape may be altered somewhat as the light passes through the correcting optic. We should have some definitions. Different parts of the target in space send out their rays. They send out different rays. And then the rays are bent in the optics, and then they hit the back of the scope. Since the telescope is round, you wind up with an image circle. And the image circle is sharpest and brightest in the middle, and as it trails off, it gets dimmer and fuzzier. We're going to put a main imaging sensor in the good part of this image circle, and we still have this little yellow part up here that we can use for other purposes. Changing the emphasis of our tracing, note how each part of the celestial field of view out here leaves something in the image circle. The yellow part comes up to the yellow part up here. The yellow rays will be hitting those hitting the guide sensor. But if we put a filter in the path, it will rob stars of some of the light that comes in. And the guider needs the light. So instead, we put a prism mirror right here that redirects the light that would have come in here up instead to a sensor that we put in a different place. And the critical thing for off-axis guiding is that the yellow and the orange parts match. They must be the same distance precisely. Well, except for some fudge factors. Since there may be flatteners and correcting optics, filters, and other glass things in between, we might have to fudge a bit. But remember those matching triangle heights. Almost all guide cameras have the basics: a relatively fast USB 2.0 or better for communication and perhaps for power, an SD4 connector for the camera to the mount, although usually your mount will be directly connected to a computer and it doesn't need the SD4 connector. They should be as small and light as possible to avoid excess load on the imaging train. Consider whether you want a puck or an eyepiece shape. Puck or an eyepiece shape. Pucks can be hard to squeeze into the space in the front of a camera body. I find the 1 1/4 barrel eyepiece body easier to mount. The rest of these recommendations over here relate to finding more stars at the longer focal lengths, slower f ratio, dimmer, and reduced field of view you will have in an off-axis guider compared to the traditional guide scope. First, you should get it as sensitive as possible, the highest quantum efficiency, and a mono without a bare matrix in color that you find in color cameras sees more light. You'll benefit from at least a 6 to 8 millimeter sensor, and bigger can be better. I do not worry about pixel size so much. The guiding software can guide at sub-pixel level, and with the extended focal length of an off-axis guider system, the resolution of your pixel size will not be a determining factor. Finally, get one as noise-free and hot pixel-free as possible. Today's lower noise cameras and dark frame removal of hot pixels help a lot, but guide stars are easier to find with a cleaner image. Think about the size of your guider. With a full-frame sensor, you simply need a bigger opening. With an APS or smaller, you may be able to get by with a smaller prism that can reach further in. A thin guider has more spacing options. By thin, I mean this distance here compared to this distance here. But beware, are they really thinner? See how this one already has its threaded connections there? How thick will these bodies be when they get their connectors? Some have easier adjustments, some require hard-to-find Allen wrenches. Consider all this when you purchase. Mostly, you want them to be light, stable, and compatible with your equipment. You'll also go through a bunch of spacers and adapters. Note one nice thing about these things, these very thin spacers over here. They may also act as washers, allow you to separate adapters that otherwise tend to weld themselves together. You're better off with threaded adapters, but as you go shopping, remember thread diameters and pitches. They must all match. The distance from the end fitting of your guide camera to the sensor should be as short as you can get. You can always add a spacer if you need more distance, but you cannot remove some spacing if the sensor is too deep in the camera. Size your prism and pick-off mirrors and your camera together so that you don't have to, but it helps to have a camera that can serve your pixel well. Get as large of both as you can with the following warnings. You must be able to fit the prism between the main image sensor and the edge of the off-axis guider housing. The bigger the prism and guide sensor, the more bucks you got to spend. 6 to 8 millimeter sizes for both will suffice, but if you've got bigger and can get them in there, that would be better. One way to focus a guide camera is to change the distance between the prism and the guide sensor. Prism will be here, guide sensor up here. On most guiders, the guide camera attaches and can be moved along a stalk that holds the prism pickoff mirror at the other end. This is the stalk, and the prism is at this end. The guide camera will be up on this end. You first mix the depth of the prism next to the main camera sensor and then slide the guide camera on the stock and focus it. That is, move its sensor as far from the prism as the prism is to the main camera sensor. In a camera with a helical focuser, like this one, often the focuser itself is attached to the stock. In these types, once the camera to prism distance is fixed, the focus does not change when you move the stock up and down. You change what the prism and sensor sees, but the guider remains in focus. In other off-axis guiders, the prism holder and the camera are independent. You still adjust the prism, and then you adjust the guide sensor, but changing the relative position of the two changes the focus. It's important to know which kind you have and how to adjust together the two of them or independently as appropriate. Some off-axis guiders allow you to move the prism and the yellow sensor from side to side. Here's our yellow sensor. We could move it over here or over to here, as you see here. This makes it capable of finding a much larger area of guide stars. Some users rejoice in their helical focuser. A little twist allows focusing the guide sensor. But seriously, once you have an off-axis guider focused, you usually just leave it there forever. Unless you have another camera or filters with a dramatically different thickness, you don't need the helical focuser again. They cut into the guider back focus, which may or may not be a problem, and they cost some bucks. Although many of us like to set up so that the guide corrections move along the RA and X axis, there is no reason for that. Some setups allow the main camera and any off-axis guider attached to it to rotate so that you can find guide stars. The main field of view can be composed, and then the guider just goes along with it. But some off-axis guiders also allow the rotation of the camera independently, the guide camera independently of the main camera field of view. This may help you locate a guide star, but be sure you don't intrude into the light path of the main sensor. And if it's not at all digitally coordinated, you may need to recalibrate the guider when you use one of these rotating off-axis guider holders. Learn what you have and learn what it does. Okay, RTFM, read that fine manual that came with your system. Figure out what parts you have, what they do, what they don't do. Look at their diagrams and all that other stuff. Get yourself educated. It's cool to have your own caliper to check things out and do other useful nerdy things around the house, but a ruler or a tape measure will do. Know where things actually are on your equipment because you'll be measuring things from these points to other such points. Most cameras run the plugs and lettering parallel to the way their sensor is set. See the lettering, plugs, sensor? The lettering can tell you, therefore, the orientation of your sensor. Checking the manual here, I see the sensor is 17.5 millimeters back from the front plate, just in front of this line on the camera body. If you don't have such convenient markers, put some blue tape on the device and mark where these things are. This is where you may measure from and to. Now, flatteners and reducers may also complicate the issues because they have specific distances that they need to be from the corrective optic to the sensor. These orange and yellow triangles must still match. If installed before the off-axis guider, nothing changes in the guider focus. But if between the off-axis guider and the main sensor, these optical correctors may affect guiding focus. If you already have the optic set up perfectly, ask yourself if you can insert the off-axis guider between it and the main sensor by removing adapters and spacers, or need to install the off-axis guider before it. Can I remove this 16.5 millimeters empty space and replace it with this 16.5 off-axis guider? Of course you can. It's just distance. The back focus remains the same. The use of the corrective optic remains the same. Okay, once you know all the distances and positions, plan it on paper, mock it up, and measure it out like these fine people on cloudy nights did. Treat your connectors and adapters nicely. Don't tighten them too much unless you're ready to keep them like that forever. They stick together. Set the prism down alongside, but barely missing the main sensor. Prism, sensor. Don't set it away too far. Don't set it away too close. If you do happen to set it away too close, or set it too close, you'll get shading on the sensor like this, or if you had this on the side, it would be like that. You need to keep it out of the image circle. You need to keep it in the image circle, but out of the sensor's way. Now, remember how those dimensions have to be accurate to the very last part of the micromillimeter, and you're all worried about that? Well, don't obsess. Come on, down. Yeah, really. Don't be obsessive at this point. Furthermore, there are hidden gremlins, like the differential refraction in the glass and filters, that may mess up all your fine calculations. Set it up as well as you can. But remember, you have a guider focusing mechanism that will cover 5 to 8 millimeters of your mistakes. In theory, you can do this in your living room. We're going to do the rough focusing. Or from your living room to the house across the street if you don't care about your reputation in the neighborhood. The best thing to do is to set up outdoors in the daytime probably, turn off the tracking, set exposure to daytime operation, choose a distant target large enough so that both you and your guider and your main camera have it in the field of view. At this stage, leave some room in your guide camera focuser travel on both sides so that you can adjust guide focus in and out. So focus the main image sensor as well as you can using only the telescope focuser. Measures from some fixed point on your tube, like here, to the back point or to some fixed point on your focusing tube. So here to here, it's 8.5 millimeters in my case. We might need to know this exact distance later. Unfortunately, this measuring tip will not help those with split Cassegrains or other concealed internal focusers. With the main camera focused now, do not touch the telescope focuser. Make sure you're not overexposed, and especially during the day. Now, go to whatever device moves your guide camera sensor in relation to the prism. I'll call these adjusters, and they vary from off-axis guider to off-axis guider. Most common is loosening the set screws, like these set screws here, and gingerly moving the camera up and down in respect to the stalk with the prism on the far end. And then you tighten the set screws. Or you can use a helical focuser, or in extreme cases by removing or adding spaces. The point is that you have to change the distance, this is where the sensor is, from the prism to the sensor in order to focus the guide camera. And note that the adjustment may in fact be between the guider body and the main imaging sensor. It's up to you to know from the manual or just studying the device to show what is proper for your setup. How do you change that distance? Focus the guide camera as well as possible and lock it down. You're in rough focus and done for now. You're not getting the focus you wanted on that guider? Well, make sure the main camera is focused and record its focus position, 8.5 millimeters in my case. Check your exposure connections and all that. Make sure the sensor in your guide camera is rotated correctly. Cover and uncover the front of your scope as it is imaging to see the camera go black and white. Make sure that your guider is in fact operating. Then ignore the main camera focus. Adjust the focus on the telescope, not the off-axis guider, but on the telescope itself with the main telescope focus control. Get a focused guide image in your guider. Ignore your main camera focusing. You're now focusing the guide camera using only the main telescope focuser. And go back and measure where you are, just as you did before. The difference between this and this is how much you need to change, how much you goofed in your initial paper planning and assembly. Either add or remove precisely this much space as and where needed. Remember, some of the distances can be changed with the adjusters, the set screw, the helical focusers. If you need more distance, consider adding or removing spacers. See the red part of this slide as to where to add or remove the space. For instance, if the guider is focusing further out, add space between the prism and the guide sensor, or remove it between the prism and the main sensor. As you are doing this, you must adjust the distance between the pick-off mirror and the guide sensor. Keep the prism in the same position and move over the guider up and down on the stock in relation to the pick-off mirror. When you have altered your imaging or off-axis guider train by these 9.1 millimeters or whatever your result was, refocus your main camera, and your guide camera should be in focus or close enough to focus with its own focusing adjusters. Respect that back focus parameter of your corrective flatteners and optics. Remember, your flattener still needs to be so many millimeters away from the actual imaging sensor. Next, it's time for the fine focus. You're simply going to go out at night and repeat the focusing you just did for your rough focus, except that you'll be outside with the tracking scope and a wide field of stars. Make sure you're getting the moon or stars in both the main and the guide camera. Both cameras must see the same type of object out there. Focus the main imager with your telescope focuser. And because you've already rough focused, it should be pretty close on your auto guider focus also. Now focus the auto guider with the adjusters you use, the fingers and set screws, helical focuser or whatever. Be gentle because you will not need much movement. And of course, lock them down. Refocus your main camera. Now look only at the guide camera result. Loop short exposures on your guider and watch the image and focus metrics as you move the focuser in stages slowly in and out. Do you get the smallest, brightest star in your imager? Don't worry about its shape. Guide stars can be really ugly. Some people claim they don't need to be focused. Off-axis guiders don't need to be focused very well. I'm not in that school of thought. The smaller and brighter they are, the better chance the guide camera can see them. That's what you're after. That's how you tell you've got good focus on the off-axis guider. There are things about off-axis guiders that we did not get a chance to cover, but you know how to space and focus your new off-axis guider, and I expect maybe you will go through this video again before you really put it all together under the stars. But if you forget the details, remember, the point is to make the orange and the yellow rays the same distance. You can do this best by knowing what is in your kit, how your off-axis guider is supposed to work, and what screw does what. And finally, the whole thing comes down to adding and removing distance in your imaging train. I hope these few minutes I have guided you well.